The night had fallen softly over the small town where the street lamps flickered like fading stars and the wind carried whispers of something unspoken. The old house on the corner stood quiet, its windows closed, its heart heavy. Within its walls lived Arian, a boy whose eyes had forgotten how to smile. His days were filled with people and words, but none that reached the place where silence had built its home. He moved through the world as if floating through fog, touching things that did not touch back, hearing voices that never spoke what they meant, and somewhere deep inside him something was waiting to be heard. His mother sat by the window every evening, her fingers tracing the same line on the old wooden table. She used to talk once, laugh even, but now she only looked at the empty chair across from her where his father used to sit before he left one stormy morning without a note. Only silence remained, and that silence spoke more than any word could. Arian remembered the sound of the rain hitting the tin roof that day. He remembered her eyes filling with unshed tears and how she never cried, not even once. She just went quiet, and from that quiet grew a wall between them. Days turned to months and Arian grew older. He started writing in a small notebook things he could never say out loud. He wrote about the sound of rain, about how silence sometimes screams louder than thunder. He wrote about the way people smile while breaking inside and how truth hides behind quiet eyes. He carried that notebook everywhere but never showed it to anyone, for the words inside were his only way of breathing. One day a new girl came to the town. Her name was Mirab, and she was unlike anyone Arian had met. She spoke gently as if every word was wrapped in care, and her laughter sounded like sunlight. She moved into the house across the street, and every morning she waved at him through her window. Sometimes he waved back, sometimes he didn't. One afternoon while he sat under the old oak tree sketching lines of thought that never turned into words, she walked up to him holding a cup of tea. She said nothing, just handed it to him and sat beside him. In that silence something stirred. He felt her presence like the warmth of dawn after a long night. They met like that every evening without talking too much. Sometimes she would hum softly, sometimes he would draw, sometimes they would just sit and let the world move around them. Slowly the silence between them started to change. It wasn't empty anymore, it was full of meaning, full of comfort and quiet understanding. It felt like home. One day she looked at him and said, "Do you ever feel like silence knows the truth better than we do?" He looked up startled because those were the words he had written in his notebook. She smiled as if she knew, and he realized that maybe she did. As days passed, he began to open up piece by piece like a book long closed. He told her about the night his father left, about the way the world sounded that morning when everything fell apart. She listened without interruption, without judgment. Her silence was kind. It didn't ask for more, it didn't offer pity, it simply held his pain gently like it was something precious. When he stopped talking, she said, "Sometimes silence tells the truth. We are too afraid to speak." He looked at her and saw the reflection of his own loneliness in her eyes. That night he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about her words, about the way her eyes shimmered like the moonlight on water. He realized how much she had changed. The sound of his days, the quiet that once haunted him, now felt alive. He picked up his notebook, and for the first time he didn't write about sorrow. He wrote about hope. He wrote about eyes that speak without words and moments that don't need sound to be understood. And for the first time in years he smiled, a real one, not the kind that hides but the kind that heals. The next morning he found a note slipped under his door. It was from Mirab. It said, "Meet me at the old bridge at sunset. There's something I need to tell you." His heart beat faster as he read it again and again. He waited all day, counting hours by the sound of the clock. When the sun began to fall and the sky turned golden, he walked to the bridge. She was already there, leaning against the railing, the wind playing with her hair. She turned when she heard his footsteps and smiled, that same quiet smile that had become his favorite. She looked at him and said, "Arian, there's something I haven't told you before, but before I do, promise me you'll listen till the end." He nodded, unsure what to expect. She took a deep breath and said, "I knew your father." He froze. Her words echoed in the space between them like thunder without sound. Her words struck him like the wind that comes before the storm, cold and sharp and filled with questions he had never thought to ask. He looked at her, searching her face for something to hold onto, but all he found was calmness, the kind that hides 1,000 storms. She stepped closer, her voice trembling slightly as she said, "My father used to work with yours before he left. Your father came to our house one night. He spoke to my parents about leaving this town, about starting somewhere new, but something happened, something he never spoke about. He disappeared before he could come back home, and then everyone stopped talking about him, as if silence could erase his existence." Arian felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had grown up believing his father had walked away without looking back, but now her words were rewriting the story he had told himself for years. He wanted to speak, to ask 100 questions, but no words came out. His voice was caught between disbelief and fear. Mirab looked down at the water below the bridge where the fading light danced like shattered glass. She said softly, "My mother told me that your father didn't leave because he wanted to. He was looking for something that would protect you and your mother, but he never made it back." She turned to him, tears glistening in her eyes. Maybe silence wasn't his choice, maybe it was forced upon him. The world seemed to blur around him, the sound of the wind, the rustle of trees, everything faded until only her voice remained. He felt tears burning behind his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He simply nodded, as if that could make sense of everything. She reached out and touched his hand. Her touch was warm, grounding like an anchor in a sea of confusion. She whispered, "I thought you should know, because truth deserves to be heard even when it comes wrapped in silence." They stood there for a long time without speaking, the river flowing beneath them, carrying away the weight of untold years. When they finally turned to leave, the air felt different, lighter somehow, yet heavier with meaning. As they walked back, he asked her softly, "How did you find this out?" She smiled sadly and said, "My father kept his old letters. I read one last week. It had your father's name at the end. The letter said, if something happens to me, tell them I never meant to leave, that I loved them, but some truths can only be hidden in silence." That night Arian sat by his window, the stars blinking like secrets waiting to be discovered. He opened his notebook but couldn't write a single word. Instead he closed his eyes and listened to the silence around him. For the first time it didn't scare him, it spoke to him. It told him that love doesn't vanish when words do. It lingers in quiet corners, in the spaces between breaths. He thought of his mother sitting by the window, still tracing that same line on the table. He knew he had to tell her. The next morning he found her there. As always, her face pale from years of waiting. He sat beside her and for a while they said nothing. Then he took her hand and whispered, "Mom, I know the truth." Her eyes widened slightly, confusion flickering across her face. He told her everything, every word Mirab had said, every feeling, every silence that had finally found a voice. When he finished, she sat very still, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "After so many years," she whispered, "your father, he never stopped loving us, did he?" Arian shook his head. "No, he didn't. He just couldn't say it out loud." She smiled through her tears and said, "Maybe silence told the truth all along." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, his mother lit a small candle by the window, something she hadn't done since his father left. It flickered softly, casting warm light across the room. Arian stood there watching the flame and realized that the quiet which once felt like emptiness was now filled with memories, laughter and love, unspoken but alive. He wrote again that night, the words flowing like rivers. He wrote of finding truth in the stillness and peace in what was never said. He wrote about how silence had never been his enemy, it had been the messenger all along. As days passed, the house began to change. Laughter returned in small echoes. The walls no longer carried only shadows. Mirab visited often. They would sit by the window with his mother, sipping tea, while the world outside moved slower around them. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't need to, and in that wordless space something beautiful grew between them, something honest and pure, like the soft hum of dawn breaking. One afternoon, while walking through the old path near the river, Arian asked Mirab, "Do you ever think silence can heal?" She smiled and said, "Maybe silence doesn't heal us, it reminds us that we can." He looked at her, and for the first time in his life he felt at peace, as if the puzzle pieces of his heart had finally found the place. The pain was still there, but it had softened, turned into something gentle, something that no longer hurt to remember. That night, as he watched the stars, he whispered into the dark, "Thank you, Father, for your silence. Thank you for loving us in the only way you could." The wind rustled the trees softly as if answering him, and for the first time he didn't feel alone anymore. Days turned into weeks and the air around their little town began to feel lighter. The quiet streets no longer echoed with emptiness, they carried stories now, stories that once hid behind silence. Arian started helping his mother rebuild the garden behind their house, a place that had long been forgotten. The soil was dry, but with each seed they planted, something inside them bloomed too. It was not just a garden, it was their way of starting again. Mirab would often join them, her laughter mixing with the rustling leaves and the soft hum of the wind. The three of them would work until the sky turned gold and the first stars appeared. One evening as the sun melted behind the trees, Mira brought an old wooden box. She said, "I found this in my attic. I think it belongs to you." Inside the box lay a collection of letters, worn and fragile with time. Arian picked one carefully. The handwriting was his father's. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. The words were faint but clear. "My dear son, if you ever read this, know that silence does not mean absence. Sometimes it is the only way to keep love safe. I may not be there to see you grow, but every day I am with you in the quiet between your thoughts, in the peace after your tears, and in the stillness of your heart." Arian could no longer hold back his tears. They came not from pain but from understanding. He read every letter, each one filled with the voice he thought he had lost forever. Every sentence felt like a heartbeat, and in that moment the distance of years vanished. His mother sat beside him, her hands trembling as she touched the letters, her eyes filled with tears that glistened like morning dew. She whispered, "He never left us, did he?" Arian shook his head and said, "No, he just loved us." In silence, the night fell softly and they lit the candle again, the one she had kept by the window for all those years. The flame flickered gently, its light touching the letters and their faces. The silence around them was no longer hollow, it was alive, filled with memories and forgiveness. Arian felt a deep calm settle within him. He turned to Mirab and said, "Thank you for bringing the truth to me." She smiled and said, "Maybe it was never lost, it was just waiting for you to listen." Time moved forward as it always does, but the way they lived changed. Arian began to write more, not about pain but about peace. He wrote stories of people who found strength in quiet places, of hearts that healed without sound. He started reading those stories aloud in the town square. Every Sunday people gathered to listen. Children sat cross-legged at his feet, old men nodded quietly, and the women smiled softly as if they too understood that sometimes silence carries more meaning than words ever could. Mirab stood by his side, always, her presence calm and steady. She never needed to say much because he already knew what she felt. Their bond had been built on silence, on understanding beyond speech. One evening after a long reading, as they walked home under the stars, Arian turned to her and said, "You taught me that silence isn't empty." She smiled and said, "No, it's full of everything we're afraid to say." They both laughed softly, the kind of laughter that feels like home. Years later, when his hair began to turn silver and his notebook was filled with countless pages, Arian looked back at his life and realized that silence had never betrayed him. It had guided him through loss, through love, through every moment that shaped him. When his mother passed away peacefully one winter night, he sat by her side holding her hand, the candle still burning by the window, the same one she had lit for his father. He whispered into the stillness, "She is with you now." And for a brief second he felt warmth on his shoulder, like a hand resting gently, a presence unseen but deeply felt. After the funeral, Arian walked to the old bridge where he had once met Mirab, where truth had first found its voice. The river below was calm, its surface shimmering with silver light. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence around him. It was soft and familiar, it spoke without words, telling him that everything had come full circle. He whispered, "Thank you for your silence, Father. Thank you for teaching me to listen." As he stood there, Mirab joined him, her hair streaked with silver too, her eyes still carrying the same warmth. She took his hand and said, "Do you hear it?" He nodded, smiling, "Yes, it's the sound of truth." He looked at her and she looked back, and in that wordless moment they understood that some truths don't need to be spoken, some stories don't need to be told aloud. They live in glances, in touches, in quiet moments when hearts speak without sound. The sky began to darken, stars appearing one by one. The world hushed in a sacred stillness, and as they stood, their hands entwined, the silence told the truth once more, not of sorrow but of love that had endured beyond time, beyond words, beyond even life itself. And the wind whispered softly through the trees, carrying with it every unspoken word, every hidden truth, until the night itself seemed to glow with peace and understanding. And in that eternal silence they finally heard everything.